Well, allow me to give you a bit of a history lesson involving the United States Air Force, or namely a portion of the United States Air Force, better known as the Strategic Air Command. From 1947 until 1992, SAC, as it was called, was an integral part of the U.S. Air Force. Frankly, the U.S. Air Force at that time had three distinct operations. SAC was one, MAC was the other, and TAC was the other. SAC stood for Strategic Air Command. MAC was the Mobile Air Mobility Command, and TAC was the Tactical Air Command. But the thing about SAC was, SAC back then was considered the most important part of the U.S. Air Force. It was commanded by General Curtis Lemay, and he became the Air Force Chief of Staff, and he was probably one of the most feared men in the entire United States Air Force because, when he walked around, he was smoking illegal back in those days because you're around jet fuel. That's what Curtis Lemay. And people lived in fear of his airplane showing up from the middle of whenever and conducting an ORI, better known as an Operational Readiness Inspection. Those are the things most feared in SAC. SAC at that time had, are you ready? 316 B-52s. And they carried nuclear bombs prepared to destroy the entire world if necessary. There was 56 F-111s. They also carried nukes. 14 EC-135s, the looking glass airplanes. 615 airborne tankers, KC-135s. 48 Titan II missiles, which they controlled. And 1,000 Minuteman II and Minuteman III ICBMs. That was all controlled by one man and one department of the United States Air Force known as the Strategic Air Command. Now, I myself had the opportunity to fly with SAC from 1970 to 1975. Flew a couple of airplanes and was the EC-135 Looking Glass and the KC-135 Tanker. And I will tell you, probably the most important plane Strategic Air Command at that time was in fact the KC-135. Now, some would argue that, but I'll tell you what, you couldn't do a flight planning, you couldn't do a task order without 35 flying gas stations there to fuel up the tank, or fuel up the bombers, fuel up the fighters, because they could normally fly about an hour, and any other aircraft that needed gas, because we were the gas station flying in the sky, and I flew that aircraft. And back in those days, you could carry around 200,000 pounds of gasoline. And you could fuel up a lot of airplanes, and that's what we did. But the purpose of SAC back in those days was mutually assured destruction. It was called MAD, M-A-D. And that was, if the Russians decided they want to get themselves into a third world war, we were going to end it, and we were going to end humanity, frankly, because with that many B-52s, that many F-111s, and everything else we had in the ICBMs, 1,000 Minutemen, we could destroy the world. And that was saying to the Russians, hey, you don't want to get involved with anything because when it's Miller time, it's Miller time. And frankly, that was a very difficult time in those years because that was called the Cold War. And the Cold War existed. And then, ultimately, when the Berlin Wall came down and Ronald Reagan got in, he ended the Cold War back in 92. SAC was dismantled, and the missiles kind of went away, and the airplanes were distributed to the various other commands. 1987 until 1992, Curtis Lemay ran the Strategic Command. He ran it with an iron fist. Those who served under him were prepared. And the biggest thing he had to deal with was being the night and scrambling your airplane, because you had to get your airplane off the ground in roughly 15 minutes or less. Because if missiles were incoming, they were going to hit. You want to be in the air before they hit. And that was the game. Alert, pulling the crew of 4 for the KC-135s back then, A models. You had a pilot, a navigator, and a boom operator. That was the crew. And you were together the entire time. 7 straight day and night, living in a great big giant concrete building and ready for when the alarm went off. That was how it was back in those days. Those days are gone now. And frankly, It's a concern to somebody that maybe we aren't as ready as we need to be in case something else happens. Now, I know we're trying to bring it back. SAC will never come back in its original fashion, if you will. Simply, we don't do some of those things anymore. And now things are different. But for anybody who served in the Strategic Air Command, SAC, during that time period of the Cold War, those are people that lived a life and did things that, well, frankly, many others couldn't do or wouldn't do. But they put their lives on the line because they knew if the flag went up, everything could end. That's how it was if you flew in the Strategic Air Command.